They thought they were untouchable. Two officers with a long history of silence and protection from the system. But on this day, inside a small California courtroom, a calm and powerful woman stood up, and shattered that illusion with 9 simple words: "I am the Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration." What followed next left the entire courtroom frozen. Welcome to True Echo, where hidden truths echo louder than lies, and justice finds a voice no matter how long it's been silenced. The courthouse in Paso Robles radiated heat by 8:15 a.m., its pale stone steps already baking under the California sun. Inside, the air buzzed, not with anticipation, but a kind of weary resignation. Locals knew what to expect from cases like these. They'd seen it too many times, a young man of color facing off against 2 officers in uniform. The scales rarely tipped toward justice. Officers Mark Rutledge and Brian Colton walked through the courthouse doors like they owned the place. Their uniforms were flawless, their badges gleaming, and their smug expressions well practiced. Mark chewed on a toothpick, tossing a lazy smirk to a clerk as he passed. Brian adjusted his belt, cracking a joke to one of the deputies. Behind them trailed 2 representatives from the department, men in suits, more concerned with optics than outcomes. In courtroom 2B, people were already gathered. The benches groaned under the weight of reporters, law students, and concerned community members. Some had come to support the defendant, Javier Montes. Others came simply to witness the system do what it usually did: shrug. Javier sat quietly at the front of the room, a slim 22-year-old with tired eyes and calloused hands. He looked like he should be studying for a biology midterm, not fighting for his future. His mother sat behind him, clutching her purse like it held her sanity. Her face was stoic, but her fingers never stopped moving, fidgeting, tightening, releasing. His public defender, Lynn Trun, was calm and methodical. She had short-cropped hair, wire-framed glasses, and a voice that carried just enough steel. She'd seen the dashcam footage, what little of it remained. A 36-second gap, right in the middle of the traffic stop. Convenient. Predictable. Maddening. The judge, Marlene Holbrook, entered the room briskly at 8:30 a.m. She was known to be strict but fair, though fair had long been a fluid concept in this courtroom. Mark leaned toward Brian, whispering, "We've had her before. She's soft when the department's watching." Brian smirked, "We'll be out by lunch." The DA opened the case with tired formalities: public trust, legal thresholds, and burden of proof. The language was polished, sterile. Javier looked smaller by the minute. When he took the stand, he tried to hold himself tall. His voice cracked once. Then again. But he didn't cry. He told the court about his job working late shifts at a gas station. About how he'd picked up a few rideshare passengers that evening. How he was just trying to get home when he noticed a cruiser behind him. "I wasn't swerving," he said. "I drive for Uber. My dashcam showed I was straight in my lane." He paused. But part of that footage is gone. He described how Officer Rutledge had yanked him from his car without warning. How Officer Colton had searched his pockets while laughing. "They said I looked nervous. That I had weed." Javier shook his head. "But I didn't. I keep my car spotless. I vacuum it every 2 days." On cross-examination, the DA didn't press hard. A few questions about Javier's past, a nod to recreational marijuana use years ago. Nothing stuck. The officers sat comfortably. They'd seen this play out before. They always came out clean. Then Lynn stood up again. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd like to call one final witness before recess." Rutledge raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't in the pre-trial motion," he muttered. "Proceed," the judge said, eyes narrowing slightly. Lynn nodded to the bailiff, who opened the courtroom door. In stepped a tall black woman in a tailored gray suit. She walked without hesitation, silent heels, a clipped pace, no wasted movement. Her presence shifted the air in the room. She looked around only once, her gaze steady and unreadable. "This is Ms. Danielle Freeman," Lynn said. Mark scoffed. "Let me guess. Civilian Oversight Board?" Brian rolled his eyes. Here comes the speech about systemic racism. But Danielle didn't take the witness stand. She reached into her blazer and removed a leather badge wallet. She handed it to the bailiff, who blinked, once, twice, then turned it to the judge. Danielle faced the courtroom and said clearly, "My name is Danielle Freeman. I am the director of the Los Angeles Field Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration." The silence was thunderous. Reporters froze mid-scribble. The judge's expression tightened. Mark's toothpick dropped from his mouth. Brian sat up straighter, but not in confidence. In fear. Danielle didn't sit. She folded her hands and stood near the witness chair, as if daring anyone to question her presence. Lynn let the moment breathe. "Before we proceed with Director Freeman," she said, "we ask that Mr. Montez be allowed to finish his account without interruption." The judge nodded. Javier stepped back to the stand. And this time, the courtroom listened. "I didn't know I was being followed at first," Javier said. "It was late. I just dropped someone near Templeton." He looked at the floor, then up again. "I rolled down my window. Officer Rutledge came up and asked me where I was coming from. I told him. He said I was acting shifty." Lynn asked, "Did they say why you were pulled over?" "He said I was swerving. But I wasn't. I have dashcam footage. The department's copy skips over it." He swallowed. "They searched me. My car. 20 minutes later they said they found a bag under the seat. I swear it wasn't mine. I'd cleaned the car that morning. And then?" Lynn prompted. "They arrested me. No Miranda rights. Just cuffs. I called my mom from the station, she didn't even know where I was for hours." Javier's mother pressed a hand to her lips. "They said it was an ounce of weed. Just enough for possession with intent. But I didn't even touch it. I asked for fingerprints. They said they didn't need all that." "No further questions," Lynn said. The DA stood but asked nothing. Danielle finally sat. As the judge called a short recess, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Mark leaned toward Brian, "She's bluffing. DEA wouldn't waste time on one kid." Brian tried to smile, but his fingers tapped nervously on the bench. Danielle's eyes tracked them quietly. Because they hadn't realized yet. This wasn't just about Javier. This was about all the ones they thought no one would ever stand for. The energy in courtroom 2B had shifted. It wasn't loud, but it was no longer indifferent. As people filtered back in from the recess, there were fewer side conversations, fewer yawns, and a lot more eyes fixed on the front of the room, specifically on Danielle Freeman. She hadn't said much yet. But her title had done enough. Danielle sat upright, hands folded, her expression unreadable. She didn't look like a federal agent out to intimidate anyone. She looked like someone who'd been waiting a long time for the right moment to speak. When Judge Holbrook returned and called the room back to order, the temperature, figuratively, dropped. Lynn Trun rose slowly. "Your Honor," she said with deliberate calm. "We now call Director Danielle Freeman to the stand. Not Ms. Freeman. Not Agent Freeman. But Director." The courtroom heard the weight of that word. And so did Mark and Brian. Danielle rose with quiet grace and walked to the stand. Her movements were precise, rehearsed without being performative. This was not her first courtroom. It might have been her 100th. She sat, crossed one leg over the other, and turned to face Lynn. "Director Freeman, for the record, could you state your full title and professional background?" "Danielle Freeman," she said. "I am the director of the Los Angeles Field Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration. I've held that role for 6 years. Prior to that, I served as a supervisory special agent in D.C., overseeing federal narcotics investigations and internal corruption probes across multi-jurisdictional task forces. She didn't flinch. Didn't over-explain. Just laid the facts down like bricks. From the defense table, Mark whispered to his lawyer, "She's here for a show. No way this holds in court." But his lawyer didn't look so sure anymore. Lynn pressed forward. "Director Freeman, can you explain why a federal agency would be involved in a local traffic stop case like this?" Danielle gave a measured nod. "It didn't begin with Mr. Montez. This case is part of a broader investigation involving repeated patterns of misconduct within the Paso Robles Police Department. Over the past 14 months, we identified a cluster of traffic stops targeting minority drivers, many of whom were searched without consent. In several cases, narcotics were recovered, but none of those substances showed fingerprints or DNA traces linking them to the driver. There it was. The first crack in the armor." Brian shifted in his seat, one hand gripping his pant leg beneath the table. Mark went still, jaw set tight. Lynn continued. "How did this come to your attention?" "An anonymous letter sent to our field office in November. It included dashcam stills, internal report excerpts, and redacted time stamps. Based on the content, we initiated a covert review and began compiling a data pattern. That led us here." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Director Freeman, are you saying this courtroom is now involved in an active DEA investigation?" "Yes, Your Honor. And pending today's proceedings, we are preparing to present findings to a federal grand jury." That statement landed like a hammer. Reporters stopped taking notes and just stared. Brian let out a low breath. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This isn't real." Danielle turned to Lynn, who gave her the space to continue. "We reviewed GPS logs from marked cruisers assigned to officers Rutledge and Colton. The data showed deviations from their patrol routes, stopping at isolated locations not listed on any official reports. One site was an unregistered warehouse located off Kyler Canyon Road." She opened a folder on her lap and handed a photograph to the bailiff. It was grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. Officer Brian Colton unlocking the warehouse door, looking directly at the camera. Brian sat forward, hard. "That's not what it looks like," he said aloud. Danielle didn't even look his way. She continued calmly, "The warehouse contained bags of narcotics, cash bundles, and several unregistered firearms. None were catalogued in any PD evidence logs. We also found crates labeled simulation training materials, which we believe were used to store off-book contraband." Mark leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering furiously. But no one could stop the momentum now. Lynn stood, flipping through her own copy of the file. "So you're telling this court that these officers operated outside department protocol?" "Yes," Danielle said. "With patterns of behavior indicative of premeditated evidence planting. This was not sloppy work. It was deliberate. It was rehearsed." The DA finally stood. "Your Honor, we have not been given access to this evidence." Lynn cut in immediately. "That's because the DEA didn't want this material compromised before the trial. It will be submitted to the grand jury and to this court, in accordance with federal procedure." The judge held up a hand. "Let the witness continue." Danielle reached into her case and pulled out a USB drive. "We installed an audio capture device in their patrol cruiser in January. The conversations recorded over 8 days confirm intent to plant evidence, mock suspects, and discuss cover-up tactics." Brian turned pale. Mark didn't move, but his fingers tapped once against the edge of the table. It was the only sign he gave. Danielle looked at the judge. "This drive is sealed, verified by 2 independent digital forensics analysts, and has been authenticated under DEA evidence protocol. You press play, Your Honor, and you'll hear their voices." She placed the drive on the evidence table with a deliberate click. Lynn turned to the judge. Your Honor, given this development, we ask that all charges against Mr. Javier Montes be dismissed and that the court review the totality of misconduct involved. Judge Holbrook didn't respond immediately. She stared at the USB. Then at Danielle. Then at the defense table. Court will recess for 1 hour, she said. We will reconvene at 1:30. And I expect full cooperation with federal evidence protocols. The gavel struck. A moment of silence hung. Then the courtroom buzzed to life. Reporters bolted for the hallway. Lawyers gathered in tight huddles. But Mark and Brian sat still, like statues with fraying edges. For the first time, they weren't the story's authors. They were its aftermath. And Danielle Freeman, she wasn't done. The courthouse break room was never meant to feel like a prison, but that's exactly what it had become for officers Mark Rutledge and Brian Colton. They were alone now, no lawyers, no department reps, just the ticking clock and the cold press of silence between them. Brian paced, sweat forming under his uniform collar. Mark leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to keep his composure, but his jaw was clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. I told you not to go back to the warehouse, Mark hissed suddenly. Brian stopped mid-step, glaring. You think this is on me? You think I planted a damn camera? You think I knew the DEA was on our backs? Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew Danielle Freeman hadn't just stumbled onto their crimes. She had been watching for months. Waiting. Documenting. And now, she'd chosen this courtroom, this moment, to pull the pin on the grenade. Back in the courtroom, the judge returned 10 minutes ahead of schedule. There was no warning, no fanfare, just the subtle sound of her chair scraping against the hardwood as she sat down and adjusted her robe. The hum in the courtroom dropped instantly. Lynn stood at the ready, Danielle at her side. Everyone knew, things were about to detonate. Danielle opened a slim black laptop and turned it toward the judge. This is the GPS movement log from cruiser number 491, assigned to officers Rutledge and Colton, she began. On February 9th, the data shows the vehicle detouring 4 miles off its scheduled patrol route, directly to the warehouse location. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. Do these logs show repeated patterns? Danielle nodded. Over a 6-week period, we recorded 17 detours to locations not listed on any patrol schedule, abandoned lots, industrial sheds, and areas not covered by department jurisdiction. 11 arrests took place within 30 minutes of those stops. Each time, the same narrative, suspected narcotics found in easy-to-access locations, no witnesses, and minor charges filed. Lynn stepped in. And were all those arrested people of color? Danielle's voice was razor-sharp. Yes. Every single one. The jury visibly stiffened. One juror, a young woman in her 20s, put her pen down and just stared at the defense table. Judge Holbrook looked to Danielle. And how were these GPS logs obtained? They were collected under warrant after preliminary red flags triggered internal database alerts. Verified by a third-party federal analyst and court-admissible under Title 18, Danielle replied. Mark and Brian had re-entered the courtroom by then, but their postures had changed. The cockiness was gone. Mark sat stiffly, his eyes glued to the table. Brian looked like a man stuck between a flood and a locked door. There was nowhere left to run. The judge turned to the defense. Officers, do you wish to respond to these findings before I consider a full federal review? Mark's attorney stood, trying to regain control. Your Honor, we request a delay in proceedings to review the newly submitted materials. Lynn was on her feet instantly. A delay only gives them time to manipulate records or pressure witnesses. Every second that passes is one more moment this pattern of abuse could continue. Brian's lawyer looked toward the DA, silently begging for help. But District Attorney Philip Greer hadn't moved. He sat frozen, his face pale and flat. When Danielle mentioned the warehouse, his lips had pressed into a thin, bloodless line. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was an exposure. Of them all. Danielle addressed the jury directly. "You don't have to believe me," she said softly. "Believe the digital footprints. The GPS data. The audio logs. The fingerprints, or lack thereof. This case wasn't built overnight. It took months. It took whistleblowers risking their jobs. It took people willing to speak when no one believed they'd be heard." She paused. "I've investigated corruption across 3 cities and 2 countries. But what I saw here, it wasn't just misconduct. It was systemic exploitation wrapped in protocol. It was silence weaponized by rank." Brian's composure finally cracked. He leaned into his lawyer's ear, but his voice wasn't low enough. "They've got the audio. The GPS. The warehouse. What do we even fight? What's left?" The courtroom heard him. Every juror. Every reporter. Javier Montes. His mother. Judge Holbrook stopped writing. Her pen hovered. Then slowly, she lowered it to the bench. Danielle closed the laptop and placed her hand on top of it. "The badge is not a license to lie. It's a duty to serve. When that duty is corrupted, the consequences must follow, regardless of uniform, regardless of years served." Lynn turned to the judge. "We're prepared to play a segment of the audio surveillance now." Mark's attorney immediately objected. "We have not authenticated or reviewed the contents." The judge didn't even blink. Overruled. This evidence was collected under federal warrant and submitted to the record. "Proceed." The bailiff wheeled in a small speaker and placed it beside the bench. Danielle stepped forward and connected the USB. A burst of static crackled, then, a voice. Mark's voice. "You see the guy's eyes? He was gonna piss himself before we even opened the door." Brian laughed in the recording. "Yeah, had that twitch. You can always tell when they're hiding something. Even if they ain't." Mark again. "Let's just toss the sock trick. Quick plant. Keep him scared." More laughter. Then Brian's voice. "Hell, we're doing him a favor. Teach him to keep his mouth shut next time." The courtroom shifted. The sound was devastating. The jury leaned in. One older juror sat back, visibly shaken. Mark's attorney jumped to his feet. "This is banter. This doesn't prove anything." Danielle didn't even look at him. "That's not banter. That's process. And the full file is 42 minutes long." The judge looked toward the evidence table. "Is this part of the sealed record?" "Yes, Your Honor," Danielle replied. "Then I will review it in full," she said. The recording stopped. Silence reigned. A dense, painful silence. And then, the unraveling. Mark turned toward Brian, his jaw twitching. "You kept talking," he said under his breath. "You didn't shut the mic off." Brian flared. "You act like this was just me. We did this together. You planted more than I ever did." Gasps swept through the courtroom. It was like glass shattering in slow motion. No one moved. Lynn didn't have to say a single word. Judge Holbrook's voice cut through the tension. "Officer Colton, one more outburst and you'll be removed." Brian sat down, trembling. Danielle stepped forward one last time. "There's a reason recordings matter," she said. "They reveal not just what was done, but how it was normalized. These weren't mistakes. This was a system. Built from silence. Enabled by indifference." Mark leaned toward his lawyer again, voice tight. "We're not taking the fall for all of it. This goes higher. She knows it." Danielle heard it. And her eyes didn't move. Because that, too, was part of the plan. The courtroom doors opened once again, and a federal marshal entered, quiet but focused, whispering to the bailiff who immediately crossed the room with a sealed envelope in hand. Judge Holbrook unfolded the document, her face neutral as she read. Then she looked directly at Danielle. "Director Freeman," she said, "I've been informed that federal arrest warrants for officers Rutledge and Colton have been signed as of 5 minutes ago." A sharp intake of breath swept through the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind. It wasn't loud, but it was collective. The kind of moment people would replay later, describing the look on Brian's face, the way Mark's hands stopped moving entirely. "Deputies," the judge continued, "you are to detain both defendants immediately." 2 uniformed deputies moved forward. Mark stood slowly, almost defiantly, as if he was staging one final performance. Brian didn't stand until the cuffs were already being fastened. Neither man resisted. But their eyes, especially Mark's, flashed with something more dangerous than fear. Resentment. Entitlement, bruised and boiling. As they were led toward the exit, Mark turned back and looked directly at Danielle. "You think this ends with us?" he said, his voice low but bitter. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't have to. She'd heard those words before. From bigger men in darker rooms. And every time, they'd fallen just like this. When the courtroom doors clicked shut behind them, the room sat in stunned silence. People weren't sure if they should clap or cry. Some looked relieved. Some looked haunted. Lynn stood again. "Your Honor, we request permission to submit further background on the department's internal culture. This case wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about how they were allowed to operate without consequences, for years." Judge Holbrook gave a slow, tired nod. "Proceed." Danielle returned to the stand, her demeanor shifting now. Less procedural. More human. "I want to be very clear," she said. "Not every officer in the Paso Robles Police Department was corrupt. But the honest ones didn't last long." She opened a file and held up a letter. "This is a resignation notice from Officer Elijah Dunn. Dated February 4th of this year. He was 26. Fresh out of the academy in Monterey. Smart. Respectful. The kind of officer any community should be proud to have." Danielle's voice softened just slightly as she read. "I'm not quitting because I'm afraid. I'm quitting because I refuse to be another bystander with a badge." A murmur passed through the gallery. Lynn approached the stand. "Did Officer Dunn file complaints before resigning?" "Yes. 2. One against Officer Colton for use of excessive force during a stop involving a teenage boy. The second against a supervising sergeant who pressured him to alter his report." "What happened to those complaints?" Lynn asked. Danielle's face hardened. "They were dismissed within a week. The internal review claimed the footage was inconclusive." She paused. "We recovered the footage. Officer Dunn had the foresight to back up his own body cam data. It clearly contradicts the official department report." Judge Holbrook leaned forward slightly. "Was this footage submitted to state review?" Danielle shook her head. "No, Your Honor. The footage was never escalated. The complaint was archived as incomplete. Standard language. But it wasn't a mistake." There was a long silence as the weight of that settled into the room. A juror whispered under his breath, "That's a cover-up." Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. Lynn asked, "Did Officer Dunn assist with your investigation?" "Yes. He provided a list of informal code terms used over the police radio. Phrases not found in any official department glossary." Danielle flipped to another document. 13B meant a nervous suspect. 19R meant young, male, alone. These codes weren't standard. They were created in-house. Specifically to target certain types of drivers. The courtroom sat frozen. No movement. No pen scribbling. Just the quiet thrum of everyone beginning to understand how deep it all went. Danielle continued. Another officer, Leanna Roscoe, requested her name be kept anonymous, but she gave us similar testimony. She transferred to Bakersfield 6 months ago. Said she couldn't sleep anymore. Judge Holbrook folded her hands under her chin. And your own experience, Director Freeman? Danielle hesitated just a moment. Then she nodded. I started in law enforcement at 22. I was the only black woman in my unit for 3 years. I worked traffic. I watched things I didn't understand at the time. The language. The body posture. The subtle shifts in tone during stops. I thought it was normal. Her voice was steady, but quieter now. Measured. Heavy. I didn't speak up then. I told myself I'd change it when I got promoted. But the longer you stay silent, the harder it becomes to remember why you started. That's why I'm here today. Because if we don't draw the line, clearly and publicly, then this just keeps happening. Someone sniffled in the back. It wasn't clear who. But it didn't matter. The room had gone from witnessing a trial to experiencing a reckoning. Lynn placed her hand on the evidence table. Your Honor, we don't need to prove a grand conspiracy. We only need to show that a pattern existed, and that it was tolerated by those who had the power to stop it. Officers Rutledge and Colton weren't just anomalies. They were a product of the silence around them. Danielle closed her folder. She didn't need to say another word. But just then, the courtroom doors opened again. A deputy approached the judge. Lieutenant Owen Krieger is requesting to speak, Your Honor. Judge Holbrook raised an eyebrow. On whose authority? His own. A pause. Then a slow nod. Bring him in. The doors opened wider. And in stepped the lieutenant of the Paso Robles Police Department. Tall, ironed uniform, rows of commendation bars on his chest. His walk was confident, but there was something performative about it. He was here to manage the narrative. Krieger didn't look at Danielle. Not once. That was intentional. Your Honor, he began smoothly. I'd like to clarify that officers Rutledge and Colton were not acting under direct department instruction. Their actions, if proven, were individual misconduct, not systemic failure. Lynn didn't hesitate. With respect, Lieutenant, are you here to testify or to salvage public perception? Krieger smiled thinly. I'm here because our department's name is being dragged through the mud. Judge Holbrook narrowed her eyes. If you're here to testify, take a seat. If not, I suggest you leave. A moment of hesitation. Then Krieger sat. Slowly. Danielle didn't blink. Your Honor, she said, lifting another document, this is a signed memo from Lieutenant Krieger. It acknowledges 2 excessive force complaints against Officer Rutledge. No disciplinary action was taken. The memo concludes, and I quote, no further action warranted at this time. Lynn added, we have 4 more memos like that. Same phrasing. Different victims. Krieger interjected. That's standard administrative language. Legal departments guide that phrasing for liability purposes. Danielle stepped in. Then let's look at action instead of words. She projected a review audit log on the screen. This document tracks body cam irregularities from February. Of 24 flagged videos, 19 were from officers Rutledge and Colton. Not one was escalated. Krieger stiffened. We don't have the resources to escalate every minor flag. Danielle's voice sharpened. These weren't minor. They were flagged for tampering and missing timestamps. That doesn't happen accidentally. The jury listened, eyes wide. The cracks weren't just showing. They were splintering. Danielle leaned forward. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here because your department created a culture where officers were taught they'd never be stopped. Where oversight was a desk away from complicity. Where silence became standard operating procedure. And with that, the weight of truth landed, undeniable and complete. The courtroom didn't applaud. They just listened. Because now, they finally believed her. The silence that followed Danielle's last words didn't just hover, it pressed. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The judge. The jury. The press. Even Lieutenant Krieger, who now sat stiffly, like a man trying not to let the walls close in too fast. And then it happened. The courtroom doors opened one more time, and another federal marshal stepped inside. He crossed to the bailiff, handed over a folder, and stepped back without saying a word. The bailiff approached the bench, passing the sealed folder to Judge Holbrook. She opened it, scanned its contents, and this time, her reaction was more than just professional protocol, her eyebrows rose. She looked up at Krieger, her voice carrying not just authority but intention. Lieutenant Krieger, she said, you are hereby ordered to comply with a federal subpoena for all internal complaint records, formal and informal, for the past 5 years. This includes archived and non-reviewed documentation. Krieger's jaw locked. A flicker of panic broke through the control in his eyes. Understood, Your Honor, he said, but the words came out like gravel. He stood to leave, but before he reached the door, Danielle's voice halted him. One last thing, she said. Lieutenant Krieger authored an internal operations memo 6 months ago outlining a disciplinary matrix that was never implemented. That matrix would have flagged 9 of the 11 stops we've reviewed today. It was approved, then shelved. Quietly. Krieger didn't turn around. He just walked out. And this time, nobody followed. Danielle remained seated. Lynn stood beside her, flipping through the documents slowly, carefully, as if to underline the fact that there was no rush, because now, finally, time was on their side. We've seen enough, Lynn said softly, to know this isn't just a case. It's a reckoning. Judge Holbrook didn't disagree. She simply raised her gavel. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. The federal evidence presented today will be reviewed overnight. Further proceedings, including the formal dismissal of all charges against Mr. Montez, will resume at 8:30 a.m. The gavel struck. And the room finally exhaled. Danielle didn't move right away. She packed her things slowly, methodically. As reporters surged toward her, she moved around them like water. No comments. No interviews. Just one look back toward the bench, where the judge still sat. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. And it was clear, the work wasn't over. But something important had begun. Later that afternoon, the storm rolled through the Paso Robles Police Department. Inside the building, chaos churned behind closed doors. Phones were confiscated. Internal affairs agents, those who had once laughed off misconduct reports, were now combing through archives, flagged emails, and missing footage logs. The chief of police, notably absent during the trial, had called an emergency meeting. But no one spoke to the press. No one wanted their face next to this story. The mayor's office issued a bland statement: we support justice, accountability, and transparency. We await the results of the federal investigation. Translation: we're not touching this until we know who's going down. That evening, while the city buzzed with headlines and rumors, Danielle drove 2 hours south. Not to give interviews. Not to file paperwork. But to a modest one-story home in Oxnard. A house that Javier Montez had once mentioned in passing, during trial prep. My grandma used to make tamales every Sunday, he'd said. She raised me till I was 13. Danielle knocked softly. An elderly woman answered, cautious at first, then surprised. I just wanted to say thank you, Danielle said, her voice warm. For raising a young man who told the truth, even when no one believed him. The woman didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she opened the door wider. A pot simmered on the stove. Danielle stayed for tea. And when she left that night, she didn't take a photo. She didn't call the press. Because real justice, she knew, didn't need headlines to matter. The next morning, the courtroom filled even faster. By 8 a.m., every seat was taken. People stood against the back wall, clustered near the doors. They weren't just court regulars. These were people who had never stepped foot inside a courthouse before. Mothers. Students. Elders. Teenagers. They didn't come to see a trial. They came to see something rare, accountability. Mark and Brian were absent now. Held in federal custody in Bakersfield, awaiting arraignment. Their lawyers didn't show up either. Danielle entered quietly through the side, no badge displayed, no entourage. She didn't need either. Her work was already sitting in the sealed evidence boxes under the judge's bench. Lynn stood next to Javier and his mother. Both looked exhausted, but calmer. Judge Holbrook entered at 8:31 on the dot. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, measured, sharp. "The court has reviewed the evidence submitted by the DEA," she said. "This includes the GPS logs, audio surveillance, warehouse footage, whistleblower testimony, and the full body cam audit logs." She paused, then continued. "Based on these findings, and the defense's failure to refute any of the submitted materials, this court finds officers Rutledge and Colton in breach of civil and constitutional rights. This case will be referred for full federal prosecution. The court recommends charges including falsification of evidence, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and conspiracy under color of law." A collective shiver rippled through the gallery. A few people gasped. Javier's mother covered her mouth with one hand. But Javier didn't cry. He just closed his eyes. Slowly. Like releasing breath he hadn't taken in months. Judge Holbrook turned to him. "Mr. Montez, the charges brought against you are hereby dismissed in full. Your record will be sealed and expunged immediately. You are free to go." Applause started in a few corners, gentle, hesitant, but was quickly swallowed by something deeper. Respect. Reverence. Lynn helped Javier to his feet. He hugged his mother tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. No speech. No grand gestures. Just relief. And when they exited the courthouse through the front, reporters descended again, flashing lights, barking questions. But Javier didn't stop. He got into a waiting car with his mother and disappeared down the street. No press conference. No soundbite. Just peace. And peace, Danielle knew, was the rarest kind of justice. Danielle didn't follow Javier outside. She remained in the quiet courtroom long after the final juror had filed out, after the lights had been dimmed and the buzz of voices faded into memory. Only the judge remained, seated in contemplative silence behind the bench. "You understand this case will be watched very closely," Judge Holbrook said softly. "Every move you make now, every press release, every follow-up arrest, every shift in policy, it will be magnified. By both those who want change, and those who want to bury it." Danielle nodded once. "That's fine," she said. "I didn't start this to be comfortable." The judge studied her for a moment, then allowed herself the faintest smile. "Neither did I." Danielle left through the back exit, avoiding the cameras and the chaos of media outside. Across town, while the press spun narratives and analysts flooded news feeds with hot takes, Danielle drove south again, this time not to testify or deliver evidence, but to breathe. She parked outside the federal building in Los Angeles and sat on a cold metal bench, envelope in hand. Inside it was everything that had come from the Montez hearing, transcripts, arrest orders, judicial recommendations, and, tucked in the back, a signed directive from the Department of Justice. Effective immediately, a full-scale federal oversight inquiry into the Paso Robles Police Department would begin. Danielle stared at the manila envelope for a long moment. Not with pride, not even with satisfaction, just wait. This was only the beginning. Audits. Interviews. Digital forensic dives. Civil rights reviews. Personnel investigations. There was no clean end. Only a deeper descent into the rot the courtroom had just started exposing. Across the plaza, her deputy director, Elisa Browning, was waving her down from the entrance. Danielle stood slowly, pocketing the envelope. But before she walked away, her eyes caught a young man on the far sidewalk. He couldn't have been more than 19. Hoodie pulled low. Earbuds in. His stride casual but cautious, like someone who had been taught to move small in a world that viewed him as large and threatening. Danielle watched him cross the street, then disappear around a corner. And for just a moment, she thought about how easily he could have been Javier. Or Elijah. Or the dozens of unnamed drivers whose stories hadn't made it to courtrooms, who had no audio files or GPS logs to save them. No Lins. No judges willing to listen. That, she thought, is why the work matters. Not to punish the guilty. But to protect the ones who should never have been hunted in the first place. That evening, Danielle drove home to her modest apartment above a bakery west of Santa Paula. The street was quiet. The windows glowed warm. She fed her dog, sorted through a week's worth of mail, and sat down at her kitchen table with a stack of notes she hadn't looked at in days. They were scribbled thoughts from the Montez case, things she'd jotted during testimony or while reviewing evidence late into the night. On one sheet, torn and wrinkled, was a single quote she hadn't written. Systems don't change when you catch the bad ones. They change when the good ones stop staying quiet. She traced the line with her finger. It was from Elijah Dunn's resignation letter. He'd sent her the original, months before, asking only that if his name ever made it into court, it be for something true. Not tragic. He got his wish. Outside, a car sped by. A dog barked. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed through an open window. Life continued. Quietly. But not blindly. The following morning, Danielle stood before a classroom of 21 students at a community college on the east side of Los Angeles. It wasn't a planned speech. Lynn had asked her, said the students were studying criminal ethics and wanted someone who knew what pushback felt like. Danielle didn't bring a presentation. She didn't wear her badge. She just stood at the front of the class and spoke. "I'm not here to tell you how to be a hero," she began. "I'm here to tell you that silence, especially the comfortable kind, is dangerous." She told them about Javier. About the missing footage. The bag under the seat. The recording that almost never saw daylight. She told them about Elijah Dunn. She didn't glorify it. She didn't make it sound noble. She told the truth. You'll be told to look the other way. You'll be told that it's just how it works. You might even be offered promotions to stay quiet. But if you choose comfort over truth, don't ever call it justice. A hand went up in the back row. A young woman with tight braids and a skeptical expression. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All of it." Danielle didn't answer right away. Then she smiled, just a little. "It's not about whether it was worth it for me," she said. "It's about whether it was worth it for the people who couldn't speak for themselves." The girl nodded slowly. That was enough. Afterward, Danielle walked to her car alone. No press. No agents. Just herself. She opened the door, slid inside, and sat for a moment, eyes resting in the rearview mirror. She wasn't looking at her reflection. She was looking at the city behind her. Still standing. Still flawed. But maybe, finally, ready to change. Danielle didn't expect a celebration. She didn't want one. Justice wasn't a ribbon cutting or a moment of applause, it was something quieter. More fragile. And it needed to be protected long after the cameras left. In the days that followed the courtroom bombshell, Paso Robles became the eye of a national storm. Media descended, headlines roared, and protests ignited on the courthouse steps. Not just about Javier Montes, but about every time someone had been stopped, searched, silenced, and no one had listened. The Department of Justice issued a formal statement confirming the launch of a full-scale federal oversight probe. 22 current and former officers were being reviewed. Internal Affairs was being replaced by an external ethics review team. The chief of police was placed on administrative leave. One local news anchor called it the beginning of a seismic shift. But Danielle didn't stick around for the coverage. Instead, she kept moving. Quietly. Methodically. She met with Elijah Dunn again, this time in person. They sat across from each other at a diner outside Fresno. Elijah was nervous, but hopeful. He'd found work with a local community center, mentoring kids who'd grown up fearing the very people he used to stand beside in uniform. "They still ask me if I'm a real cop," he said, sipping his coffee. "And when I say no, they finally smile." Danielle nodded. "You did more by walking away than some officers do in a 20-year career." He shook his head. "I didn't know if I was doing the right thing." "You did," she said simply. Before they parted, she handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were documents confirming his cooperation in the federal case, documents that would protect him if the department ever came looking. "You're not alone in this," she said. He smiled. A small one. But real. Back in LA, Danielle stepped into her office for the first time in nearly a week. The walls were lined with case files, evidence maps, and digital logs. Her inbox overflowed with messages, some congratulatory, others seething. The thin ones were the most dangerous. Emails that didn't yell, but suggested. Warned. Tried to remind her that institutions, like buildings, prefer their shadows intact. She ignored them. Because something far more important had landed on her desk. A handwritten note. Folded once. From Javier. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for seeing me. I'm going back to school. I'll make this count." That was the closure she hadn't known she needed. Not an indictment. Not a press headline. But a 22-year-old finally able to breathe again. That Friday, Danielle met Lynn Tran at a cafe near downtown. It was the first time either of them had sat down without a legal file between them. Lynn looked tired, but fulfilled. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee, "we just sent a shockwave through half the precincts in California." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Only half?" Lynn laughed quietly. "Give it time." They talked about next steps. About oversight reform. About new guidelines for body cam storage and review. But mostly, they just sat. Two women who had gone to war with a system and lived to keep fighting. Before they left, Lynn looked Danielle in the eye. "That courtroom. You didn't just win a case. You gave people something they didn't expect." "What's that?" Danielle asked. "Proof." Danielle didn't reply. She just nodded once, and walked into the sunlight. Across the country, in neighborhoods like Javier's, stories of the trial spread. In barbershops. On podcasts. In classrooms. People didn't just remember the fall of two officers. They remembered the woman who stood in front of them all and said, "Not anymore." And behind the scenes, policy began to shift. Quietly. But steadily. The DEA began offering new grants for whistleblower protection programs in local law enforcement. Judge Holbrook, in partnership with federal agencies, led a task force on judicial review of surveillance evidence. Lynn Tran was promoted to senior civil rights prosecutor. And Danielle? She stayed where she was. Not because she was done, but because her work was far from over. Every day brought another file. Another case. Another anonymous tip. And she read each one like it mattered, because it did. One morning, her deputy asked her, "Don't you ever get tired of fighting?" Danielle looked up from her desk. "I don't fight," she said. "I protect." That afternoon, she stood before another crowd, this time at a high school assembly in Long Beach. Rows of teenagers, restless and half listening. Until she spoke. "You'll be told a lot of things in life," she said. "That you're too young. Too loud. Too angry. Too quiet. That justice is someone else's job." She paused. "But don't believe it." She looked at them, not over their heads, but into their eyes. "If something doesn't feel right, say something. If someone needs help, do something. Don't wait for a title or a badge. Justice starts the moment someone decides not to be silent anymore." When she finished, no one clapped right away. They were just quiet. Processing. Learning. That was more powerful than applause. And if you walked past that school that day, or stepped into that courtroom the week before, or happened to cross paths with Danielle Freeman anywhere in the country, you might not have noticed her. No cameras followed her. No parades waited. But change never starts with a spotlight. It starts with someone willing to hold the line when no one else will. And Danielle Freeman? She didn't just hold the line. She redrew it. For Javier. For Elijah. For every kid who's ever looked into a rearview mirror and wondered if the sirens behind them were coming for their skin or their soul. Because in a world that too often shields the powerful, she chose to protect the unheard. And that choice, it echoed louder than any badge ever could. If you've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or afraid to speak up, this story is for you. Justice isn't just about catching the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. It's about the people who choose truth, even when it's hard. Even when it costs everything. Quote. "Systems don't change when you catch the bad ones. They change when the good ones stop staying quiet." Elijah Dunn. If this story moved you, subscribe, share, and comment below. Help us amplify stories like Danielle's. Because truth needs a voice. And here at True Echo, we make sure it's heard.